Now that we know how to plot points, let's look at a couple of things that we can find from them. The first thing we're going to look at is the distance formula. For the distance formula, the idea is we're going to find the distance between 2 points, x1, y1, and x2, y2. And we're going to denote the distance by this d of a comma b. So that means the distance between a and b. So the idea is we have some coordinate plane. And we have two random points a and b. While I drew b in the first quadrant and a in the second, they don't have to be. They can be anywhere on the plane. And the first thing we're going to do is actually draw a right triangle between these 2 points. The distance of this bottom leg is going to be the distance of the one further to the right minus the distance of the one further to the left. The height here is going to be the distance of the higher point minus the lower point. So one is x2 minus x1, the other one is y2 minus y1. And I put these in absolute value because if I put a above b, then that would be y1 minus y2. We now want to use the Pythagorean theorem. We know this hypotenuse is my distance. So let's use the Pythagorean theorem. So the Pythagorean theorem says a leg squared plus a leg squared is equal to the hypotenuse squared. It's important to note now that the absolute values in the squares, we can get rid of the absolute value. The whole point of the absolute value is to keep this number positive, but when we square it, it's going to be positive anyway. Finally, we have the distance squared, but we don't want that, so we're just going to go ahead and take the square root of both sides. So now I have the distance from a to b is x2 minus the square root of x2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 squared. And now I can use this as a formula. So for any 2 points, I can just stick it into this formula and I can find the distance. So let's look at an example. I have the points 3, -2 and -1, 5. So we'll let a be x1 and y1. And then b will be x2 and y2. So we start with the fact that we have the distance from a to b. We know we're going to need a square root. We then have x2 minus x1 squared, so -1 minus 3 squared. We then add y2 minus y1 squared, so 5 minus -2 squared. We then start by simplifying the stuff in parentheses, so we go ahead and do our subtractions. We can then square our values. And then finally we add 16 plus 49. And we have our solution is the square root of 65. The next thing we want to look at is our midpoint formula. So once again we need to start with 2 points. So the idea, we have our 2 random points a and b. We're going to think of a line segment between them. And we want to find the coordinates of this point M that's exactly halfway between a and b. And this is how we'll find it. x1 plus x2 over 2, comma y1 plus y2 over 2. We essentially average the x coordinates and average the y. So let's look at an example. Here's our 2 points. A is 3, -2, and b is -1, 5. In order to find the midpoint, we start with the x coordinates, 3 and -1. So I have 3 plus -1 over 2. We then deal with the y coordinates, -2 and 5, so -2 plus 5 over 2. We can then start simplifying. Simplifying the top of the fractions gives me 2 over 2 and 3 over 2. And once I simplify that, I have that my midpoint is 1, 1.5.